Sexuality was one of the great obstacles and hurdles that the very first followers of Jesus had to address as they continued to spread this good news of faith and hope and love to everyone throughout the world in the first century. See, sexuality has always been something that human beings in general deal with and experience, but sexuality especially is a topic for followers of Jesus that presents unique issues. We're going to have to talk about our sexuality in this Trinity session. And to do that, we have to understand the basics of the biblical understanding of sex. And we don't have time to get into all that, but I'm going to give you a few points, and maybe you can apply the spiritual discipline of study to the topic later, or if you want to meet up sometime, we can chat in person, over the phone, or whatever as well. But the basic connection we need to make as followers of Jesus is this: that sexuality is not something that we need to see as evil or shameful or bad. That it is, in fact, a gift from God, and it is a dimension of what it means to be a person. We don't need to walk around feeling bad. We don't need to feel shame. We don't need to live a life filled with fear or guilt about the very natural and good feelings that our sexuality creates within us. On the other side of this is the issue of following and being led and being enslaved to pleasure. And that is, as followers of Jesus, even though sex is a gift and it is good and it is pure, on the other side of that, as a human who lives in a body and has a body, we are very susceptible to things that feel good. And we're often tempted to constantly follow good feelings and pleasure. And our job is to not treat our sexuality as the point of our life or the point of our identity. In fact, I would say here in 2020, in the 21st century, the modern dilemma is how many people have tied their identity and their well-being to sexuality. I don't care what people say, whether it's gay or straight or their preferences and how that all works. People have too much attached who they are and their identity to their sexuality. That's a huge mistake, because you and I are defined by bigger dimensions to our life. And you and I are not just our bodies. You and I are not just a person. We are a soul. We are a whole thing. We are physical and we are spiritual. That's what it means to be a soul. And it's so important for us to understand our sexuality, because if we ignore this, or if we pretend it's not there, or if we overly pay attention to our sexuality, if we let it govern our lives, it ends up creating us into people we don't want to be. And even worse, people who following Jesus becomes not possible because of how governed we are by our desires or by the ways that we shame and block very natural good things within us. And so it's so important that we talk about this. So the earliest Christians, they dealt with this. In fact, they showed up with their Jesus message in the first century, and one of the first obstacles was all the Greek religion that had dominated the world, and some of the Greek gods and goddesses, the way you worshiped them, demanded that you went to a temple and you practice sexual experiences with people. That's right. They would hire people. There'd be people who were living in the temple, and their job was for you to go be intimate with them so that you could say you worshiped today. That is, I know to us, sounds so weird, maybe comical, strange, horrible, but we have to remember that's the world that the first time people started talking about Jesus, that's the world that the message spread throughout. And they had to face this. In fact, Paul wrote to these Corinthian Christians in the letter called 1 Corinthians. When he wrote this letter, he was addressing this very issue. And he said to them this line, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17. Whoever is joined to the Lord becomes one with him, one with Christ in spirit. Then he says, verse 18, keep far away from sexual sins. All the other sins a person commits are outside of the body, but sexual sins are sins against their own body. Don't you know that you have a body and that it is the temple of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit is in you, and you have received the Spirit from God. You do not belong to yourself. Christ has paid the price for you. So use your body in a way that honors God. This was the basic, and for Paul and the first Christians, the new teaching about sexuality. It wasn't all restriction. Paul never made any statement about sexuality being bad and the actual dimension of our life that is intimate and sexual, that's bad. But what he is saying is that we are understanding our life and our body in a whole new way. And that is why the first followers of Jesus developed the spiritual discipline called chastity. That's right. How crazy is this Trinity session, right? The spiritual discipline of chastity. And here's how you define chastity. It is when you and I purposefully turn away from dwelling on the sexual dimension to our relationships in order that we would grow in our ability to not be governed by them. Let me say that again. When you and I intentionally, purposefully turn away from dwelling and focusing on the sexual dimension of our life and of our relationships, we do that because we're trying to make sure that we are not governed or enslaved to that dimension of our life. You and I need this more than ever. We live in a world that rewards us for trying to be as sexy as possible. So many of us have based our identity and our life and our value on our sexuality. For some of us, we're trapped by the need to be sexy and to look sexy and to be noticed and how people rate us on their TBH moments and how people talk about us and whether people are saying, oh man, did you see him? Did you see her? And then some of us, we've based our identity on declaring what our sexuality is. We've placed our whole life, we've changed how we look, how we talk, how we feel, just so people can know what our sexuality is. And some of us have turned sexuality into this thing that we never talk about. It's horrible, it's scary, it's weird, it creeps me out. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to bring that up. It makes me feel shameful, makes me feel guilty, and that, my friends, is not the way. And all of us have built an identity around one of these ways of looking at it, and it's not helping us. Because God's path for all of our lives is that we would live as a soul who is both spiritual and physical, who is both sexual and who is able to operate in the world in normal ways. See, the reason you and I must not ever allow ourselves to be governed only by the sexual dimension of our life is because it will shut you down from being able to lead in the other dimensions of your life. You see, this is information that isn't just important for young people. It's not just important for single people. This is still true for married people, for young people, old people, for people who are single, for people who are married. This is still true. If your life is governed by your sexuality, it leads to disappointment and it does not help you follow Jesus. To base our identity on that is to base our identity on something that is shifting and unstable. To base our identity on how we feel at different moments and what we want and what we don't want is to base your life on something that will always disappoint you. And I don't know about you, but I think most of us can't handle any more disappointment. Some of us act like our life is so disappointing and then we live this way and it disappoints us and we can't imagine why. Sexuality is more than natural. It's more than nature. It is more than physical. Sexuality is a unique dimension to what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a soul, to have a body and to have a spirit. And it is fragile, it is sacred, it is something to give deep respect to. It's also something to not focus on all the time. It's something to not worry about and to shape everything about. Now, I recognize we all have strong feelings and we all are at many times overwhelmed by the power of that dimension to our life. But there's no need for us to follow it or more importantly, let it govern our lives. What you and I simply get to do is shape our life around the things that matter most. And I assure you, from anyone who's being honest with you, your sexuality, what you want, what you desire, is not the thing to base your life on. The earliest Christians found this out in the most challenging of ways because the religions around them were leading people to become worse and worse and worse. In fact, what they've found throughout history is that many of these people who practice sexuality openly and freely without rules, it led to people more and more being hurt, being in pain, being isolated, and it still propagated at first an idea where, oh, just do what you want, there's no judgment, but it ended up on the back end hurting people and causing great shame and pain and shaping entire generations of people to either be obsessed with sexuality or to hate it and run from it. But being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus, when we follow Jesus, you know what it does? It opens us up to say yes, to just say, yes, I have a sexuality. I'm not worried about it. I'm not going to focus my life on it, but I appreciate it. It's a gift. It's a unique dimension of my life. I believe that following Jesus allows us to honor that part of our life and keep it respectfully. And so what you and I must choose to do is we must stop believing the lies around us and the screens that you and I look at every day that continue to remind us that that's the most important thing. That's what we should always think about. Here's our practice for you for this Trinity session. And as sensitive and as delicate and as weird as it may be, what we want you to do is answer some questions about this with your group. And then we want you to practice this today. We want you to take note, like actually write it down, of all the times throughout this next week, okay? The next week, I want you to just be aware of yourself better this next week. Take note of the times and of the people and of the occasions that turn your attention to sexuality. I want you to take record of all the different moments something is selling sex to you, of all the different moments that your focus has been transfixed on that. And I want you to take record of it, and I want you to notice, number one, how often it's happening. But more importantly, what I want you to notice is how much around you, people, things, screens, are telling you that that's the most important thing. And would you, with the other spiritual disciplines we've been learning about, would you choose to hear God's still, small, tender voice speaking to you, reminding you that you are so much more than how sexy you are. You are so much more than your sexuality. You are so much more than just a bag of skin with a bunch of feelings inside. You are so much more. You are a soul. You have an eternal dimension to your life. You have been created for good works, which God has planned for you to do. And you and I, when we follow Jesus, my guarantee to you is that what you and I will do when we follow him and we put this discipline of chastity in our life, we will begin to actually hold the sexual dimension of our life well and not treat it like it's pure evil and not treat it like it is our God to worship. Instead, you and I live freely and loosely and able to be fully human the way Jesus taught us to be. I know that this is a challenging, difficult, weird topic, but what I pray and what my blessing for you is that you may come to see that you are not an angel and you are not an animal, and that you are not a problem to solve. You don't have to fix these feelings. All you need to do is follow Jesus. Place Jesus Christ at the center of your being. Allow him to lead and guide you. May you find the joy, the peace, and that every dimension of your life finds its fulfillment in him.